Okay, in this session, we will discuss the future of jobs in the age of AI. And we will look at how technology affects jobs, the future of skills and what skills will be needed in the future, and whether artificial intelligence is actually the cause or maybe even the cure for digital displacement. And to do this, I'm joined by Michael Priddis, who is the CEO of Faethm AI. Hi, Michael.
Hi, Bernard. Good to be with you.
Yeah, no, good. Where are you joining us from today?
I'm here in the dark in the evening in Sydney, Australia. So right now it's coming up to 8:30 p.m.
Very good, very good. So you founded Fathom, and the mission of that organization is to prepare the world for the future of work and be the global data source for the fourth industrial revolution. Before this, you were a partner at Boston Consulting Group and the managing director for Asia of BCG's technology innovation practice, Digital Ventures. So maybe you can give us a little bit more background about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, thanks, Bernard. So prior to Fathom, I spent about 20 years in product design, product development. As you say, I ran the digital ventures practice for BCG across Asia Pacific. And going back to about 2010, 2012 or so, I started to see a pattern, which is that I was responsible for leading quite large teams of people to build technology-driven products and businesses. And as I would hand over the results of what we built to our clients, I'd find myself invariably talking to the CEO, CMO, CTO, CDO, CIO, but never the chief people officer. In most large enterprise organizations at that time, HR was really just a fulfillment function. It didn't have a seat at the strategic table. It wasn't driving kind of policy and strategy in the way that it is today. And what I could see was that working across so many different industries in about 25 different countries, mostly in Asia Pacific, but also Europe and North America, I just started to see a pattern. And the pattern was that as we would deliver these new technology-driven products and businesses, companies would get very excited about the market effect, but be quite unaware of the organizational consequence. There was a lot of media emerging at the time talking in very apocalyptic terms about automation and redundancy and job losses and universal basic income. And it just didn't gel with what I was seeing on the ground, Bernard. What I was seeing was that while technologies would automate some tasks, they would create other tasks. And really, I thought there was an opportunity to think about how do we transition people when technology arrives from jobs of today to jobs of tomorrow. So I left BCG to set up Fathom. That was 5 years ago next week, actually. We spent 18 months building the first version of the platform. We launched in October 2017. We now have clients in 21 industries in 26 countries. So it's been quite a journey over the last couple of years.
Yeah, very good. So you talk about the impact of technology on jobs, that it will create some jobs, it will destroy others. So, and we're now in this fourth industrial revolution. So how do you see technology impacting the future of work at the moment? What are the key impacts? How is work changing, driven by technology?
So there's several different parts to the answer, Ben, but perhaps before I start, maybe just to kind of explain to the people listening how we're in a position to answer that. So we're the first company in Asia Pacific to be invited to join the World Economic Forum's Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And a couple of years ago, the forum asked me to be one of the inaugural members of the Global Artificial Intelligence Council. So the experience that I'm about to draw on is really advising companies and governments and people like the forum over the last few years about this topic. Typically, when companies or people, leaders of any sort, ask us how will technology impact jobs, there are three major impacts. The first one is some tasks and therefore jobs will be automated. Most in the short term will be augmented, and there'll be many tasks added. And so when we use a data-centric, AI-driven way of understanding the impact of technology on jobs and skills, we can see that there are patterns across different types of work. And it tends to be those jobs that are more routine, process-based, and information-based that are susceptible to software-based automation. And those jobs that are mechanical or to do with lifting and fetching and carrying and so on that are more driven by hardware automation. So on the software side, a classic example is an accountant. So it won't surprise anybody on this call, that will be automating, or the world will be automating, an awful lot of routine financial processing work over the years ahead. And our analysis worldwide across the OECD says about 35 to 40% of accounting work is automatable over the next decade. And that adds up to an awful lot of people affected. But there's a global cybersecurity talent shortage, and we all know why that is. And so what we're looking to do is, rather than companies make those accountants redundant when that work is automated, is to give them targeted learning and development to transition them to those hard to fill cyber intelligence, cybersecurity roles. And it's that transitional effect that companies around the world are using our software to achieve. On the built side, let's say mining companies, for example, a lot of autonomous vehicles, heavy machinery being replaced with robots and so on. And again, a very similar effect. Displacement of the individual, but retasking, reskilling, upskilling to provide them for new jobs into the future.
Okay, so we will see automation where technology takes jobs away. We see augmentation, which obviously this would be the biggest part, where every job is going to change driven by technology. And then what was the third one?
Addition. Automation, augmentation, and addition.
Very good. And do you feel, so I think the net outcome of all of this, will we have more jobs in the future or fewer jobs? What's your assessment there?
It really depends on the industry, excuse me, the industry and the economy. So there are many jobs in many industries that will be very hard to fill in the future. For example, data science or some of the creative industry jobs, many of the jobs that involved advanced technology skills. There'll also be a surplus of workers, let's say in the kind of more routine processing or let's say retail roles, call center roles, junior clerical roles, administrative roles, and so on. It really depends on how governments and companies respond as to whether or not there will be a surplus of people or jobs. Many governments around the world are really, really getting right on top of this topic. I think the use of our software in governments as far away as Canada, from Australia to Canada, Australia to Singapore, the UK, even most recently with the Texas government in the US, is showing that governments are really starting to think about economic policy to drive reskilling and industry investment, so that as technology arrives, they're able to reskill their people, and so there isn't a surplus of people, that people are able to follow the work. That's definitely not a guaranteed outcome. It does need governments and companies to lead on this, but I think we're generally speaking optimistic that technology will create a huge amount of new work whilst it also displaces current workers. The trick is, again, as I mentioned, how we transition people through skills development.
And how do you do that?
So the software in the platform analyzes the impact of technology on every job, and it does this through something that we call an occupation ontology. So at the heart of our platform is the richest, most detailed, most sophisticated view of work available anywhere. So we describe 5,600 or so jobs in, if you like, molecular or kind of at the atomic level. So 25,000 different tasks, 13,000 different skills. We integrate to all the different taxonomies around the world. So you can think of this as a universal model for work. We separately have analytics that describe the impact of every known emerging technology in every industry, in every country worldwide. When we use AI to join the two, the AI is we've taught to understand that when you deploy a particular technology into a particular context of work, you affect the supply and demand for the skills and tasks and the people and so on. What you also do is identify which jobs are created. Another part of the platform is called the job corridor. It's probably the most often used part of the platform. And it's there to show the leaders of these organizations, the managers of these companies and of these governments, what the opportunities are to retrain somebody from one job into a new job in the future. And that retraining program then consists of skills development, knowledge development, their ability to do new tasks, that then informs how they engage with education platforms like Degreed or Go1 or any of the major edtech players to inform how they go about buying education and learning and development at scale. So it's really targeting the learning and development efforts of major companies and governments all over the world.
Very good. So different technologies will influence work in different ways, obviously. So what's your assessment of how technology will impact specific job roles, for example?
So companies are obviously quite reluctant to experiment with emerging technologies where that impacts the customer relationship. So companies like to deploy technology into a controllable environment. And so that's different. A controllable environment is different in different industries. So let's take a couple of examples. Let's say banking, retail, and say farming. In a banking environment, banks are full of processes. They're full of information flow. And so a classic technology that's being deployed there at scale is robotic process automation. The leading companies like UiPath and Blue Prism are very, very busy worldwide automating many of those processes. That then has a real human effect. And so we're seeing the jobs effect, if you like, in those internal processes first. In a mining environment or a farming environment, it's the heavy machinery that's being automated. Whilst in retail, it's a combination of some of the shop front areas, like let's say shelf filling, but particularly in the warehouses. So it's different technologies in different industrial contexts, but they tend to be very controlled environments. In the longer term, as those technologies mature and as those companies get better at the use of them, they'll progressively move more to the customer experience. But right now, most companies are not taking risks with their customers. They're making sure their customer experience is driven by people. There is some automation where possible, but generally automation is happening inside the organization.
Interesting. So how should employees address the challenge of intelligent technologies displacing human workers?
So I think companies and governments have a great responsibility to make sure that people have opportunities to learn, but individuals need to turn up to that learning wanting to learn too. There's an old expression, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And I think what we're seeing at the moment throughout this period that's become known as the fourth industrial revolution is this is a systemic change. This is a change that's going to affect most people. And really, people need to be thinking a bit about what are the skills that I'll need in the future. Given the occupation I'm in, the industry I'm in, what are the likely technologies that will affect me? Does my company or the organization that I work for have a program in place to really think about the impact of technology in my job and my colleagues' jobs? And is there learning and development available to help me use these new technologies so that I'm able to be a productive part of that organization? So I think there's a lot of people really... Sorry, go on.
No, that is amazing. And you obviously look across so many different jobs and so many different skills. What are some of the skills that you would highlight as maybe most at risk, and what are some of the skills where you think they have a strong future if anyone is thinking about reskilling? Those are the kind of skills to focus on.
So there's a way that we try and capture this idea, which is to say that computers are good at the jobs we find hard and bad at the jobs we find easy. What I mean by that is that we're not built as human beings to lift and carry heavy objects, to be calculators or processors, to dig holes or fetch things. We've always used tools throughout history to do these jobs for us. And it just happens that at this point in evolution, the tools are getting better than us. But those tools, whether hardware or software, will find it very difficult and may never automate the things that are fundamentally human. Care, compassion, creativity, dealing with ambiguity, being innovative, being able to inspire others, being able to empower others, being able to motivate, being able to have ingenious ideas and to be entrepreneurial and so on. And what we're seeing across pretty much every type of industry in every part of the world is a shift from that first type of work to that second. And what that means is that, now to come to your question, the skills of the future. We will need technology skills. STEM skills are never going to stop being important. But we need those human skills, the ability to design, the ability to iterate, the ability to inquire, the ability to synthesize. And these are teachable skills. We're not teaching them at the scale that we need to, but they are teachable skills. People can learn, they can adjust, and they can take these opportunities in the future. But they need to understand that the future of work is a much more human space, even though it will be much more driven or augmented by these new technologies.
Very good. So I have three children between the ages of 9 and 15. What would you say? How can I help them prepare for this new world? What are some of the tips that you would give parents to say, okay, these are ways you can help to prepare your kids for this new fourth industrial revolution?
So I'm just smiling because back in the day when I used to speak at conferences, this was a common question from the audience. Everybody's always very concerned about what does that mean for my children. And I'm reminded by a 2x2 cartoon that I saw a few years ago. And it's the same father and daughter talking in 1990 and in 2020. And in 1990, he's saying to his daughter, look, it's fine if you want to be an artist or a ballerina, just make sure you've got law or accounting to fall back on. Now he's saying, look, it's fine if you want to be an accountant or a lawyer, just make sure you've got something creative to fall back on. And I think really that sort of goes to the heart of it. This is a humanization of work. There's a way, again, I try and sort of put these kind of quite simple ideas around something that's quite complex. I really dislike the term fourth industrial revolution. Revolution is a conflict word. It's about winners and losers, the power of the people, and so on. It's very evocative of, smoky old towns and factories and so on. And there have been two instances in history when science and technology have changed every job everywhere. And we called them the first and second Renaissance. I don't see any reason why in 20, 30, 40 years' time, we won't look back on this period and say this was the beginning of the third Renaissance, a mass humanization of work, the use of software and hardware to automate things that we should never have been doing in the first place, the freeing up of human time, the ability to use that capacity to be more creative, to work in much more sort of human engaging ways. The second kind of key message is that really any job that fundamentally involves people-to-people interactions will need more of it. So that could be to do with customer-facing roles. It could be to do with healthcare. It could be to do with service provision. I mean, I think there's many, many types of jobs. And in fact, probably many people on this call will be in jobs that didn't exist 10 years ago. And we'll always see that progression into new types of work. The main characteristic will be a humanization of work. And therefore, what that means in terms of teachable skills and advice to children, it's the ability to interact with others, the ability to create, the ability to empower, the ability to synthesize. I think synthesis is probably the single biggest, most also underrated skill. If you think of a good doctor, they don't just look at the blood test, they look at your body language, your tone of voice, the expression in your eyes. We talk about bedside manner being the separation of one good doctor from a bad doctor. These are all people skills, even in a job as technical and as scientific as being a doctor. It's people skills.
Yeah, no, I share that positive, optimistic view that actually technology and the transition, whether it's a revolution or a renaissance we're going through at the moment, is actually making our jobs better. And many of, exactly as you say, many of the jobs that we currently do, humans shouldn't really be doing. But the challenge is, how do we transition from where we are today to where we need to be in the future? Are
Yes.
you optimistic that we'll manage this transition? Because I'm thinking about the job roles that will be displaced in the future, from taxi drivers to supermarket checkout people. Lots of people have those kind of jobs. Do you feel that they will be able to easily transition to this future of work where we focus on the more human skills?
Bernard, unfortunately, not without help. So I am short-term concerned, long-term optimistic. My colleagues in London, so we have an office in London, another in Austin in Texas. My colleagues in London recently produced a UK State of the Workforce report, and I'll just pull out a couple of the statistics. So our analysis on the UK census data shows that 4.8% of work completed today in the UK is automatable, and that's 1.4 million roles automatable today. Only 2.9% is augmentable, and so there's clearly a gap. Wholesale and retail are likely to be the most affected, and there's nearly 1 million jobs. There's 800,000 jobs overall affected by that. Unfortunately, the opportunities that the future work bring are also not evenly geographically distributed. So most of the opportunities will be in metro centres, whilst most of the impact, and if you like, the negative aspects of the supply and demand of this, will be felt in regional towns and cities. That pattern is true worldwide. So there are analyses that we've been doing continuously over the last 3 years. The Boston Consulting Group produced a report last week called Jobs in the Era of AI. It's the biggest report the BCG have done to date on future of work. It's 40 pages of quite technical analysis, as you'd expect from BCG, and Faethm was the only data source. And that covered Germany, Australia, and the USA. And really, the story is very similar. There'll be a surplus of people in some jobs. There'll be a deficit in others. Governments as a whole need to be thinking today about how they start investing in upskilling, reskilling, and transitioning people, because this change has people probably on this call are well familiar with. The change has begun. I'm afraid that the solution is lagging, but I think through these sorts of conversations and the work that firms like BCG do, or that our partners in all the different consulting firms and tech firms that we work with do, the advocacy for what we're saying is growing, and government after government is taking notice and starting to engage in the data. But the bigger job is I'm afraid still ahead of us.
Yeah, I really enjoyed reading the BCG report, which I can recommend to anyone listening here. I think it makes very interesting reading that really paints the picture that you've outlined, and it also makes the point that the pandemic has actually accelerated some of this digital displacement.
Absolutely.
So do you believe that it is the responsibility of businesses or governments or individuals to resolve this issue?
Well, I think we all have a part to play, but unfortunately, the governments of all countries don't operate in quite the same way. What we are tending to find is that governments who were perhaps a little slow off the mark 5 or 6, 7 years ago are becoming really, really active in this space in the last 12 months because of COVID. So I think COVID has had 2 or 3 different effects. So just to kind of pause on this topic first. We've always talked about COVID being a slingshot to 2023. The reason we say that, in terms of technology usage, I mean, and the reason that we say that is that in 2019, many companies were experimenting with these technologies. When the pandemic began and everybody started working from home, most of those companies started really accelerating their rollout of these automation technologies because they were concerned about the sustainability of their organizations. At the same time, COVID has also sharpened their minds in terms of their responsibilities to the employers. We've all seen that phrase time and again, we're in it together. Nobody really wants to be pushing workers out into the job queues. We're already all worried about the community effect, the social effect. And so whilst I think corporate social responsibility is not the driving force in this, if you like, the mental calculations of leaders and companies, most companies are probably more unwilling today than they were in 2019 to automate and make redundant. They're looking for opportunities to reskill and upskill. Government is clearly very concerned about this. Most countries experienced some level of economic recession last year, and many countries are still in recession. And what that's done is that's meant governments worldwide are really, really upping the ante in terms of their use of our software, the engagements that we have, and their ability to use our software and our analytics to pinpoint where they invest in industry renewal, in economic scenario modeling, in reskilling of the individual at every level. Many universities and learning and development companies, people like Pearson, have made resources available for free, and individual workers know, this is something that I need to get a grip, to really understand. I've lost count of the number of times I've been on a ferry or a bus or sitting in a bar, and I've heard people at the next table say, a robot's going to take my job. It's not quite true, but I definitely think people are very alert to the issue. So I think everybody has a role to play. Government really is the key, if you like, funding source for a lot of this, but companies worldwide are really taking a lot of responsibility for this. There was some recent media coverage of Zurich Insurance in the UK, and they announced that following their use of Faethm, they're retraining 3,000 UK employees instead of making them redundant. And I've got to tell you, I mean, that's just one of the most amazing things that we've seen. That's why Faethm was set up. 3,000 people in the UK not looking for a new job in a pandemic. So I think everybody, government, industry, and the individual, and academia and research organizations and so on, are becoming increasingly active on this. And we're seeing the results of that in terms of demand for our software and our analytics.
That's great. So you talked about some industries that will be affected. So maybe you can just do a recap on what industries do you expect to see, or that you expect to be most affected by technology, and then look at some of the job roles in those industries and sectors, and how we actually start to protect some of those jobs.
Sure. So I think anything to do with information processing in any industry. So that could be, let's say, underwriting, or it could be mortgage applications, or it could be providing bankers with information of research and analytics about a particular product. All of that work is eminently automatable. Also automatable is anything really that's cognitive and routine. So any sort of research work, content generation, and so on. The application of that work is where we see augmentation. So the creative industries will grow, the marketing type organizations that really focus on individually delivered customer service or customer experience, things that require product innovation, new ways of delivering new products and thinking of new products and new business models and the creation of those. So design jobs, product development jobs, and then anybody involved in taking those to market. So sales, marketing, and so on. These jobs, I think, are all very secure. So where we see high volumes, as I mentioned, of cognitive routine processing or of low cognitive routine activity, so shelf stacking, checkout working, driving, a mechanical object like a tractor from one end of a field to another, anything that's to do with kind of treatment works or plant works or capital kind of intensive, manufacturing sites where essentially the people who are administering a robotic process already, just not delivered by robots, it's just delivered by machinery. That machinery will get more and more intelligent and we'll need fewer people to look after the machinery. So, I mean, industry by industry, the things that are probably going to have the biggest effect: financial services, retail, telecoms, utilities, all those sorts of very, very large information-intensive organizations that currently employ tens of thousands of people in information processing roles. That'll probably be where we see the biggest effect. There's an interesting overlay as well, Bernard, are actually around gender and diversity and inclusion issues. There are more women who are going to be affected by automation in those industries than men, because there are more women in administrative roles, clerical roles, job sharing roles, part-time roles, and in roles where they return to the workforce after having children. And so unfortunately, there is a gender imbalance, and those industries most affected by that gender imbalance is financial services, retail, and professional services. On the male, where the men are more affected, it's in manufacturing, freight, distribution, logistics, mining, and so on, those heavy primary industries. When you overlay a geographic lens over the top of that, most of that first group are metro, most of that second group are regional industries. Then we have regional towns, which will have their own particular type of effect. And again, I'm afraid not a great effect. Most regional towns have a McDonald's, they have a cinema, they have a supermarket and so on. They don't have the new industries that are coming that can create new jobs. Many of the younger people already have left those regional towns for the cities. So it tends to be the older workers who are least able to kind of get those jobs of the future, partly because of location, partly because of their familiarity with these new technologies that are likely to be most affected. So to paraphrase from William Gibson, the future of work is already here and the opportunities are not evenly distributed. And so that really requires government and industry to really think, well, what does this mean for our call center in a regional town? What does it mean for the remote workers? What does it mean for people who are in information processing roles that might be in another city? And so we really need to understand that the supply and demand for labor and the job creation and job loss will not happen in the same location. And therefore, where we can see locations that are affected, we have to be particularly careful to look after those people.
Yeah, interesting. So you talk about that some of those jobs will be mainly available in these metropolitan areas. But the other thing that I think we've seen during COVID is that more people are now working remotely. More businesses are set up for people to work from anywhere. Do you see this having an impact? Because I think about, I do a lot of work with Silicon Valley companies, and they are now happy for people to work from home indefinitely from anywhere. So will this change this dynamic a little bit?
I think it's too early to tell, and I don't have deep data on this topic. But to answer with more opinion rather than in terms of having heaps of data on this, my sense from talking to companies around the world is that this will not be a characteristic in the long term. I think COVID and remote working have allowed us to work from home at a level or a kind of a level of intensity or duration that we never would have expected 18 months ago. But I think much work remains fundamentally interactive. I think a lot of people are crying out for proximity to others, interaction with others. My guess is that if anybody on this call is in lockdown right now, they're probably itching to get back to the office. And whilst some of those Silicon Valley tech companies were kind of early movers, I mean, Facebook said this, and I think Twitter and Instagram both said this quite early on, that you can work from home forever. And we actually saw Pinterest axing, spending 89.5 million about a year ago to exit a lease agreement in San Francisco. It was a vast amount of money to exit a lease agreement. My sense is that people want to go back to the office. I think, however, that we won't go back 5 days a week, that we're likely, both companies and individuals, to say, well, what do we learn from this? We learned that technology can allow us to work from home, that we crave that human interaction, that human contact, that we know that we're more productive, that we're more creative, that we're more, whatever we need to be when we're working with other people. But we're also able, through technology and its augmentation effect, and the automation of some of the tasks that we've done in the past, to work independently at home. So I think we'll see much more blended work. And I think that will lead to real estate redesign, companies perhaps needing less overall floor space, but also starting to apply some of those things that they've talked about for 10 or 15 years, about taking the desks away and creating more sort of design spaces or innovation spaces, learning and development spaces, and so on. So I think we'll see more of a fusion rather than a binary, will it be at home or will it be in the workplace? And I think those tech companies that have said you can work from home forever, we'll probably read about them in 6 or 12 months as perhaps changing that.
Very good. I'm just having a little look through the stream and the comments people are sending in. People are joining us from all over the world. We've got people from India, from Austria, the Netherlands, from Milan in Italy, from Egypt, from Bournemouth in England, from another one from Germany. So nice, everyone, to keep this going. Say hello. We've got Edson from Brazil joining us, someone from China. So it's great to have everyone on.
Can I volunteer something? Listening to you there, you mentioned a few countries, Egypt, Brazil, and what have you, which are the kind of the fast growth developing economies, rather than let's say the US, UK type economies. The future of work in those economies is again slightly different. So what we're looking at when we talk about many of the governments that are responding, they tend to be governments that have an education infrastructure. So to people who are joining or who are taking part in those other economies, I think there's probably a greater emphasis on the individual to become more self-reliant for learning and development. I don't see those governments yet investing into the same degree in learning and development at scale across their communities. Fathom's done a lot of work for the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and for different governments around Asia Pacific. And so we've done analyses that led to a bilateral trade agreement and economic strategy between Australia and India, for example. And so we've got some familiarity with the way that different economies around the world are dealing with this. And not every economy is equally prepared. And what that means is that if you think, and you're listening to this now, if you think that you're in a country where the government is not yet actively thinking about this, it probably means that the individual needs to take a bit more responsibility in the short term.
Very good. And there's one, Bilal was asking a question here. Where can I find some free resources to help me reskill and upskill? Do you have any advice there?
Yeah, I mean, LinkedIn Learning is obviously just a fantastic resource. Coursera. I think I've said to quite a few people, you could do a lot worse than Googling your job, your industry, your country, and then skills development. There's a vast amount of information online. Finding it is not always straightforward. I mentioned that Pearson have a huge resource that they've put out in as a result of COVID, in order to allow people to find skills development. Microsoft and Microsoft Learning have huge amounts of content as well. So the content repositories are out there. It will take a little bit of time to find them, but LinkedIn Learning would be a great place to start.
Very good. So how do firms ensure technology actually creates jobs for existing employees rather than forcing redundancies?
So there's a very simple way that we frame this, which is that it is cheaper to retrain and redeploy than to make redundant and rehire. And there was a time where this type of conversation would be happening in a corporate social responsibility environment. That's not the case anymore. Most companies know now that when they introduce a new technology, they're going to automate some work, but they're going to create other work. Most companies are comfortable with the idea that there will be jobs in the future, and most people around the world understand that we're not suddenly all going to become free agents with nothing to do. There'll always be work. Most people, I think, are probably comfortable with this idea of transitioning. And therefore, it becomes a case of how quickly, how cheaply, how cost effectively can we pinpoint that learning and development that's needed. And that's what Faethm does. So we have artificial intelligence and this massive data resource of jobs and skills and tasks, and a software as a service platform. So clients just upload their workforce data. We have an AI that maps that into our models, and it delivers insights in the SaaS layer that helps companies to understand, these are the jobs I won't need. These are the jobs that I will need more of. This is the learning and development gap. This is how I need to retrain these people. And this product is now in use, as I mentioned before, in 21 industries in 26 countries, major clients worldwide like Zurich and MasterCard, but it's really companies of all sizes and types that use us.
Great, wonderful. So, and I guess what businesses want to identify some of those transferable skills, right? How do businesses identify them?
So in every single job, there will be a list of different tasks and skills that they do that we've been able to develop. When companies give us their data, they might say, let's say, financial controller or traffic attendant or whatever it might be. We're able to describe that job in all its different component parts, all the different skills and all the different tasks, and then show that company where they can use those skills and tasks elsewhere across the workforce and how they can move people with learning and development and upskilling and reskilling to different jobs. There've been a few cases in the public arena of us doing this. PwC is one of our big global alliance partners, and they built a product called SkillsBridge that was piloted in Luxembourg and won awards for adult learning and development. So SkillsBridge is a national learning and development platform. That means that everybody in Luxembourg has a personalized development journey. Now, clearly, Luxembourg is a very small place. It was a pilot across the EU. In North America, Google funded the world's biggest public-private innovation hub, the Mars Discovery District, to build something called PlanX. And again, it uses Faethm software to help Canadians understand how they can transition through learning development. So the software that we've built is being used to exactly this purpose all over the world. And it's our job really to do all the analytics and the heavy lifting to make sure that companies are able to use a relatively simple software product to identify, this is what we could do with Mike, this is what we can do with Bernard, these are the opportunities that they can take, this is how we can keep them employed, and this is the training that they need. And I mean, we can go into the data science a bit more, but at the product level, it's actually pretty simple. Upload your workforce data, see which jobs you need less of, which you need more of, identify the learning and development gaps, hit the button on training.
So what we want to do is we want to look at your existing employees, the skills they have. You want to look at the future skills you need, and then you want to close the gaps between them. So you make sure you help everyone working for your organization to be a valuable contributor to your business in the future. What are some of the potential risks to businesses that don't invest in reskilling?
Right. So there's a couple of really significant ones. Most people, again, when we think of the fourth industrial revolution, will be comfortable with the idea of exponential changes in technology. So we've all been very familiar with these people sort of drawing their hands like this and saying, technology is moving really quickly. That also applies to the companies using those technologies. There was a time until a few years ago when many companies around the world would talk about being fast followers. So our strategic response is to watch the leaders and do what they do as quickly as we can. But that doesn't work anymore. I mentioned earlier in the call that many people, many companies are investigating, experimenting, and deploying these new technologies internally. So by the time that the fast followers see that happening, those leading companies have already got 2 or 3 years experience. They've got failures they've learned from. They've run their experiments. They've identified what works. And by the time the rest of us see it, they're heading up that curve. Now, we can observe what they're doing and become fast followers, and we join that journey. So we're also on that curve, but they're pulling ahead faster, and that gap gets bigger and bigger. And what it means is that the fast followers become ever smaller objects in the rear view mirror of the leaders. And what that means is that leaders will take out ever more greater market share. So those companies that don't move today, those companies that play wait and see, And those governments that don't invest today, instead preferring to see what happens in the UK, what happens in Singapore, what happens in the US or Canada, or those countries that are really investing in it, those countries will be the ones that win. And there's a really simple idea that summarizes this. In a globalized world, jobs, companies, and capital move to where there are skilled people using good tech. So if we're not investing in those new technologies, and we're not investing in skills, we won't get the companies, we won't get the jobs, we won't get the capital. Other countries or companies will, and they'll continue to pull ahead. So the number one risk right now for leaders of companies and governments is playing wait and see. The second risk really is a COVID pandemic recession specific risk. People, I think, increasingly are becoming aware of this idea called a K-shaped recovery. The basic idea is that industries worldwide in March and April last year took a nosedive. Everybody suffered, everybody went home, no one knew what was happening, no one bought anything, no one sold anything, things ground to a halt. And everybody took a nosedive. Some industries are down, are staying down, and may never recover, but some industries are already starting to climb back up, the K-shaped recovery. The problem is that different industries are on different arms of that K in different countries. And a lot of that's to do with the economic policy that those governments have put in place. So an example here would be to contrast the US, the UK, and Australia when it comes to how people looked after the workers. So in Australia, there was a JobKeeper allowance that was paid to individual companies. It was a fixed amount per employee. The Brits had a furlough scheme, so the government paid a proportion of people's salaries. And in the US, they paid money to the individual. And if you remember, nearly 40 million people were made redundant. So different industries, different countries, different economies responding differently means that some countries have really figured this out and some countries have not yet figured it out. And one of the things that we're doing a lot of at the moment with our economic scenario modeling is helping governments and national leaders or state government leaders to identify which of the industries on different arms of that K in your particular state or your particular country. How many people are employed? What is the likely trajectory, of either decline or growth out of recession? And how can those governments invest in or fund more growth, more, a faster journey out of recession, so that people ultimately, their lives are improved and more people are employed and we see fewer people in the job queues? That's a product that we've only recently launched, but it's something that, as I mentioned, we're doing a lot of around the world, as far away as Texas.
Very good. So you touched on this a little bit already, but what are the risks for the wider society then if we don't reskill our people and prepare them for this future of work?
When we have a geographic density of a particular type of occupation, and that occupation is adversely affected by technology, that really quickly becomes a social problem. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Many different parts of the world have coal mining or mining generally as a major industry driver. So in Australia, Western Australia, in Europe, Northern Poland. In the US, it's the Midwest. And all of these different mining industry areas are going to be in decline. But what that means is that because so many other industries rely on the dollars or the pounds or whatever that's produced by that primary industry type, when that's affected, all of the others are affected. So geographic density of particular types of occupations can be quite risky. There are many examples of companies worldwide that locate their back office services in another location. So talking about the UK as an example, the major banks will have their customer facing and let's say their kind of premium business areas in London, but they'll have their contact center in Cardiff or Durham or Newcastle or Liverpool. And there'll be large groups of people employed in these, let's say, back office functions in shared service center or sort of single sort of service center environments. Because there are so many people doing very similar jobs and those jobs are information processing, when the technologies arrive that automate, they have a really significant effect on those geographies. So many types of work where they're geographically based become, or they present sort of social problems for those governments and those companies. I mentioned before that many regional towns will also be impacted adversely. On the flip side, there are many jobs that are going to be created in some of those regional centres. London, New York, and so on. But any place that invests in attracting companies, and Austin, Texas would be a great example, or Seattle in the US, where the governments have got wise to this. They've changed the tax regimes. They've made it easier for companies to set up and do business. And that's now leading to the Californian exodus, which is the name given now to so many tech companies leaving the Bay Area and moving to Austin. So there's a lot of mobility still. It'll take time for these things to happen. But there is a downside, and I don't like to be. I'm fundamentally an optimistic person. I want to see things happen well for people. But I think the first step, there's that expression, forewarned is forearmed, right? And I think if we can understand that there are some downside effects, this isn't something to take lightly. This is a real issue. It is really happening, and not everybody will come through this right unless those of us on this call, the governments that we support or advise, or in some cases lead, the companies that we lead, unless we start taking action, the effects will get worse.
I mean, some people, when you talk about the impact of AI and technology displacing jobs, they talk about a universal basic income, for example, as one possible solution, that you simply give everyone a certain amount that they can live on. What are your views on that?
Again, it's not something I have deep insight on, Bernard. It's not something that the economist in me doesn't see it working. I think people want to work. The idea that you could just simply give somebody some money and they will just go away and be happy, be content, not produce, not contribute, not interact with others. So I think UBI on its own is not a solution. And I think people are people, and they're everyone is on a bell curve, and some of those people will use that money for the things that are going to make them happy, and some of them will use that money in ways that they shouldn't, or perhaps that won't help them in the long term. So I think UBI on its own is too much of a silver bullet. I don't think it's something that will work on its own. It could potentially work if there are all sorts of other programs that people can engage in, if there are facilities provided, if some of the stigma attached to that is removed. But I think the number one issue is that not everybody will be on universal basic income. There'll be some people who still need to produce. And again, people are people. I don't see those people just being generally happy that I'm going to work today, but these 5 people are not, because I'm paying their salaries. So there have been a few experiments in UBI. I don't know if any of them, I think the Finns, Finland had a reasonable experience with it, but I know that they're not continuing that program, which perhaps says it all.
Very good. So what will the future of work look like if we don't take this human-based approach?
So if we don't take the human-based approach, I think, and I'm happy to say, Bernard, I don't think that is a likely outcome. I think governments and companies understand now that there are many jobs in the future that we will not be able to resource unless we invest in digital skills development, unless we invest in new industries, unless we invest in infrastructure programs and so on. So I do not see a situation where we will have a jobless class. Harari, who's the author of Homo Deus and Sapiens, talked about the advent of the jobless class. And I think that's just not only a terrible idea of a terrible prediction or prophecy, but I don't think it's likely. I don't think we're going to have lots of people with literally nothing to do. I don't think society as a whole will stand for it. And I also see that there are many opportunities that technology creates. I think what will unfortunately happen is that some countries will see this sooner and will move faster and will teach and train and reskill and invest in industries, and they will probably reap the lion's share of the reward. But I think over time, the other countries will catch up because they will see those leaders doing it. There'll be fast followers. They will suffer in the way that I mentioned because they didn't act as soon as they might, but they'll get there in the end. I do not see a situation where we will have a human-free environment or a situation where companies will mercilessly slash and burn their way through their organizations, taking out, 30-40% of people and pushing them onto to government to sort out, there would be a revolt, and that would be a fourth industrial revolution. So I don't see that situation happening either.
Good. Let's hope we won't. When we spoke before, you said that AI could be the solution rather than the problem. So when we talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning, is it the cause or the cure of some of the displacement that we are talking about today? What are your views on that?
Let me give you a real scenario. And so it's a scenario because it's going to happen in the future, but every single component part of what I'm about to say is something that I've firsthand experienced and know of programs of work that are doing this. So let me give you a problem that we're often told about. When we have electric cars or autonomous cars, we won't need drivers. Well, that's 10 or 15 years' time. And I did read one report that said, until an autonomous car can navigate an Italian hill village, they'll never be truly autonomous. So let's think about a bit nearer term, let's say 5 or 10 years. Let's look at the impact of electric vehicles. So we can see worldwide, partly as a result of climate change and partly as a result of customer preference and the performance elements of electric vehicles, that manufacturer after manufacturer is saying we're going to do away with the combustion engine and we're going to go electric. I do not see the end of petrol stations and service stations. I see the repurposing. So along the period of time that we move from petrol and oil to electric, we'll still need places to charge them. And then ultimately they become solar powered. What I've just said is massive infrastructure change. It's a whole range of new products in terms of solar products. Those products need to be delivered and sold and marketed. And we just talked about one industry, the shift from gasoline or petrol to electric vehicles. We're also then saying, okay, what do we do with these petrol stations? If we're not going to need charging stations that we go to, we're going to be able to charge them at home. We have super fast battery charging and so on. That means that we're no longer having to spend half an hour at a kind of Tesla station like we do today. What happens to that space? So along the same time that we have electric vehicles going mainstream and a shift in one industry to another, and all those new jobs created in that electric vehicle industry, which is on the near horizon, we're also seeing the growth of drones and the use of drones as for last mile delivery. Now, if you took a country like Australia, I do not see a situation where there is one drone base in Alice Springs doing linear journeys to Perth and Sydney and Melbourne and Canberra and so on. We're clearly going to have drone networks in the community, and there are pilot programs happening all over the world. And in fact, Google's pilot program for last mile drone delivery happens to be in Canberra, the capital of Australia. So these programs are underway right now. There are several new technologies that need to be built, though, for those drones to become mass use. It is inevitable that sometimes drones are going to fail. So they need sensors and secondary motors to make sure they don't land in prams. Secondly, there's going to be situations where drones are on a collision. We need to make sure they don't turn away but into each other. So that's real-time sensing and communication between these objects. We also don't want malicious use of drones with regard to flying them into the side of office buildings. So we'll need a whole range of protective measures and regulatory measures. In short, there is an awful lot of work involved in getting drones from where they are today to a mass use last mile delivery device. When that's done, we're still going to need somewhere in the community for the drones to be based. We're better than today's petrol stations. We strip out the insides, we turn them into micro distribution centers, we put robotics inside with the drone nest on the top, and the drones are now flying last mile delivery so that you can go online and buy a product in 10 minutes, not 10 hours later, it's been delivered to your doorstep. Now, every single part of what I've just said, I know of companies innovating in that space, whether it's the software that has real-time kind of messaging between drones, whether it's sensors for when drones fail, whether it's to do with motors or what have you, whether it's to do with electric vehicle fast charge batteries, and so on and so forth. Now, what we're looking at is the end of the petrol and oil industry as we know it today, and in 10 years' time, a very, very different shaped Middle East. Those countries are also investing in tourism, investing in conferencing, investing in innovation, and so on. So I think companies around the world, governments around the world can see these changes. It doesn't take that much to really think about all the new jobs that will be created as we move from the internal combustion engine to electric cars. and then ultimately to autonomous vehicles and what that means for new road designs and road layouts and so on. There are many jobs that will be created. The trick is to understand what happens systemically. It's complicated, but that's why we have the software that does that work for us.
Very good. So what are your hopes and predictions for the future of work, both in short and the long term?
I think in the short term, my big hope, but also my expectation and therefore prediction, is that future of work becomes something that every major company resources with a team. So we have a lot of people wanting to invest in us, and investors often say to me, "Is this something people are going to use all the time?" And I say, "Do you remember business intelligence in the late 90s? No one did it. Only a few companies did it, and now everybody does it." I think we're going to see the same thing with future of work. We're going to stop calling it future of work. We're going to start referring it to as the evolution of work. It's just a natural part of how we run our companies. We will have workforce intelligence or future work specialists or learning and development with analytics people inside our operations and our HR functions. And these people will be managing day to day the dynamic nature of technology's introduction to the workplace and the workforce. We're seeing the leading companies around the world already do this. So my short-term expectation is that most large companies, even medium-sized companies, will resource this topic as a business as usual activity inside their organizations. My second expectation and hope is that governments realize that not every company is going to get there on its own, and that not every person, excuse me, is going to be looked after. Not every company is going to do this, do responsible automation, and they'll start putting in kind of economy-wide provision to look after the people that are displaced. My third expectation is that we'll shed the fear around this. We'll put all those stories about white-collar Armageddon and the jobs apocalypse behind us as people start looking at the leaders like Zurich, who are quite clearly using software like Fathom's to retrain, redeploy, not make redundant, not have to rehire, but transition. I think we'll start losing this idea of automation equals redundancy, which the newspapers and these kind of more, let's say, sensationalist magazines and conferences and so on are largely responsible for. The fact of the matter is that automation should equal transition, not automation equal redundancy.
Yeah, interesting. Great way to end this. Just before we come to a conclusion, what I see happening at the moment is that we talked about this, how a fact that we might have this industrial revolution or this third renaissance that you talked about, and we've had those big transitional milestones throughout history. What I see at the moment is that there's so many different technological advances coming all at once, from artificial intelligence to synthetic biology to gene editing to so many different things, that I can only see a continuous acceleration of those evolutions that you talk about. The jobs will only change faster, that the half-life of our skills will get ever shorter. Is this something you are seeing too?
Absolutely. And in fact, Bernard, I would add to what you said, climate change is going to be a massive driver of new types of work. And I've got to say, I'm delighted about that. People are worldwide realizing that we're not going to figure this out. We're not going to solve climate change just by spraying a few less CFCs or trying to buy carbon offsets when we buy an airline ticket. There are a whole range of new products, a whole range of new industries that will be created specifically to deal with climate change. Secondly, we're seeing trade and international trade change. Supply chain has been thrown out of the window and kind of landed and reset itself as a result of the pandemic. And the pandemic itself will create all sorts of new changes. I think the number one thing that we can say about this is that the next 10 years, the next 15 years, 20 years or so, we'll see dynamic change coming from every direction. And that makes it all the more, it's what we hear from our clients, is that the number one thing that they get from Fathom is the ability to model all of those different things and then say, what does this mean to my organization? What does this mean for my company? And what do I do about it? There's so many reports out there that I think we're kind of done with reports. We're done with these high level statements. Everyone is saying, okay, I get it. There's a lot happening. What do I do about it? And that's why we're seeing such growth and such demand for Fathom. But yeah, I mean, climate change, trade change, pandemic driven change, technology driven change. Change is the main thing that's going to that's going to characterize really, I think, the rest of our working lives.
Very good, and I love the positive nature of and your optimism, which I share very much. That actually we're facing challenges like climate change that we've never faced before, and this offers huge opportunities for businesses, and hopefully with all of this we will make the world a better place for everyone and a more human place. That's my hope, and
Absolutely.
hopefully you share this.
Here's
Thank
to
you so much,
the
Michael, for
third
your
renaissance.
pardon.
Here's to the third renaissance.
Exactly. I love this. I might adopt this from now on because I think it's such it Renaissance is such a better word than revolution. Thank you so much, Michael, for your time today. Anyone who wants to connect with you, how do they do that?
You can find me on LinkedIn. So my name is at the bottom of the screen here. Fortunately, I've got quite an unusual surname. So if you just hit Michael Priddis, you'll probably find me. I'll do my best to come back to everybody personally, and yeah, look forward to all those interactions.
Very good. Thank you so much, Michael, for the time today.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, Ben. Take care.
Bye bye.